The detective's flashlight beam swept across the frozen creek bed, catching something pale half buried in snow beneath a cottonwood tree. He stopped. The shape was wrong, too still, too human. His breath clouded the January air as he radioed for backup, already knowing what dawn would confirm. If you like stories like this, make sure to subscribe and like the video. The case that would haunt Flagstaff, Arizona for nearly 2 decades began on New Year's Day 1997, when 22-year-old Jessica Brennan failed to return home from a celebration she had attended the night before. Her roommate, Emily Carter, initially assumed Jessica had stayed overnight with friends after the festivities. But when January 2nd arrived with no word, no phone call, and Jessica's car still parked behind their apartment complex on North Leroux Street, Emily contacted the Flagstaff Police Department. The report was filed at 3:47 in the afternoon. Jessica Brennan was officially missing. Jessica had moved to Flagstaff 16 months earlier from Tucson, drawn by the mountain town's quieter pace and the job opportunity at a local insurance office where she worked as a claims processor. She had graduated from the University of Arizona in 1995 with a degree in business administration. Friends described her as organized, punctual, and cautious. She was not someone who disappeared without explanation. The last confirmed sighting placed her at a New Year's Eve gathering at the home of coworkers on the east side of town. She had left the party alone around 11:30, telling others she wanted to get home before midnight to call her parents in Tucson. She never made that call. The initial investigation moved quickly. Detectives canvassed the route between the party location and Jessica's apartment, a drive that should have taken no more than 15 minutes along Milton Road and through the residential streets near Northern Arizona University. Her vehicle, a 1994 Toyota Camry, showed no signs of mechanical failure. The keys were missing. Her purse was gone. Inside the apartment, her bed was made. Mail sat unopened on the kitchen counter. Everything suggested an interruption, an unplanned detour that had gone terribly wrong. Search teams combed the area surrounding both locations. Volunteers from the university and local community groups joined law enforcement in grid searches through the ponderosa pine forests that surrounded Flagstaff. The temperature had dropped below freezing on New Year's Eve, and a light snow had fallen overnight, complicating efforts to locate any physical evidence. Flyers bearing Jessica's photograph appeared on telephone poles, in shop windows, and at gas stations throughout Coconino County. Local television stations in Phoenix picked up the story. Jessica's parents drove north and made tearful appeals during press conferences held at the police department. Days became weeks. Detectives interviewed everyone who had attended the New Year's Eve party. Each person was accounted for. Timelines were constructed and verified. Jessica's ex-boyfriend from Tucson was located and cleared. Her financial records showed no unusual activity. There were no signs of planning, no indication she intended to leave voluntarily. The case shifted from a missing person investigation to something darker. On January 14th, a cross-country skier following a trail near Picture Canyon, roughly 8 miles northeast of downtown Flagstaff, noticed what appeared to be a jacket partially covered by snow near the base of a large cottonwood tree. He approached and immediately retreated, skiing back to the trailhead to call authorities. Sheriff's deputies arrived within 20 minutes. The body of Jessica Brennan was found in a shallow depression, covered by 2 weeks of accumulated snowfall and pine needles. She was fully clothed. There was no identification on her person, but dental records would confirm her identity within 48 hours. The autopsy was conducted at the Coconino County Medical Examiner's office. Due to the freezing temperatures and snow coverage, the body showed limited decomposition, which aided the forensic examination. The cause of death was determined to be ligature strangulation. Petechial hemorrhaging in the eyes and ligature marks on the neck were consistent with compression by a cord or rope. There was no evidence of sexual assault. Toxicology results came back negative for drugs and showed only a blood alcohol content of 0.04, well below the legal limit and consistent with having consumed 1 or 2 drinks hours before death. The time of death was estimated between 11:45 on December 31st and 2 in the morning on January 1st. She had likely died within an hour or 2 of leaving the party. Investigators focused on the location where the body was discovered. Picture Canyon was accessible by vehicle via Forest Service roads, but in winter those roads were often impassable without four-wheel drive. The area was remote, heavily wooded, and not a place someone would stumble upon by accident. Whoever had left Jessica's body there knew the terrain. Evidence technicians processed the scene meticulously. Tire impressions were photographed but proved inconclusive due to the packed snow and multiple vehicle tracks from Forest Service and recreational users. No weapon was recovered. The ligature was not found at the scene. Personal effects including her purse, keys, and the clothing she had worn to the party were missing. Detectives returned to the question of who had been in the area that night. Forest Service records were pulled. Residents living along the access roads were interviewed. A few reported hearing vehicles late on New Year's Eve, but nothing specific enough to generate leads. The investigation expanded to examine anyone with a connection to both Jessica and the Picture Canyon area. This included coworkers, acquaintances from the university community, and individuals with prior arrests for violent offenses in Coconino County. One name surfaced during background checks: Derek Hollies, a 31-year-old construction worker who had done subcontracting work for the property management company that owned Jessica's apartment complex. He had been on-site in December for repairs to exterior lighting. A routine interview was conducted. Hollies stated he had been home alone on New Year's Eve. He lived in a small rental house on the northwest side of Flagstaff. He owned a truck. He was familiar with the forest roads. Detectives noted his responses but had no physical evidence linking him to Jessica or the crime scene. Without more, the interview went nowhere. As winter gave way to spring, the case cooled. Media attention faded. Detectives continued working leads, but each dead-ended. Jessica's family established a reward fund. Anniversaries brought renewed appeals. The case file remained open, but active leads dried up. Years passed, detectives retired. New personnel took over. The case became one of dozens of unsolved homicides in northern Arizona, a folder in a filing cabinet, a name in a database, a family without answers. 16 years later, in 2013, advances in forensic technology brought new hope. The evidence collected from Jessica's body and clothing was re-examined using updated DNA analysis methods. Touch DNA, a technique that can recover genetic material from skin cells left on objects, had become more refined. Samples taken from the collar of Jessica's jacket yielded a partial DNA profile. It was not enough for a definitive match in the criminal databases, but it was preserved and logged. The case remained cold. The break came in late 2016, nearly 20 years after Jessica's death. A woman named Patricia Hollies contacted the Flagstaff Police Department with information she described as urgent. Patricia was the ex-wife of Derek Hollies. They had divorced in 2003 after 6 years of marriage. She explained that during their marriage, Derek had been controlling, volatile, and had a history she had not fully understood until years later. After their divorce, she had moved to Nevada and rebuilt her life. She remarried, but something had been weighing on her conscience for years. Patricia Hollies told detectives that in early January 1997, just days after Jessica Brennan's disappearance had been reported in the news, Derek had exhibited behavior that unsettled her. He had burned items in a barrel behind their house, which was not unusual for disposing of construction debris, but the intensity of his actions that particular night remained etched in her memory. He had insisted she stay inside. He had been agitated, packing, and had come in smelling of smoke and gasoline. When she asked what he was doing, he snapped at her to mind her own business. She had been too frightened to press further. At the time, Patricia had attributed his mood to work stress and the holidays, but after Jessica's body was found and Derek was interviewed by police, he became withdrawn and paranoid for months afterward. He checked news reports obsessively. He avoided driving past certain areas of town. Patricia had been young, isolated, and economically dependent on Derek. She convinced herself she was imagining connections that were not there. Over the years, guilt gnawed at her. After her divorce, after therapy, after building the emotional strength to confront what she had witnessed, Patricia began to believe she had remained silent about something crucial. In 2016, she finally reached out. Detectives listened carefully. They reopened the case file and re-examined the 1997 interview with Derek Hollies. His alibi had never been corroborated. He had claimed to be home alone, and Patricia, when briefly questioned at the time, had supported that statement out of fear and conditioning. Now, nearly 2 decades later, she was recanting. She stated that Derek had not been home on New Year's Eve. He had left around 10 in the evening, telling her he was going to check on a work site. He returned after 3 in the morning. His boots were muddy. His hands were scratched. He had showered immediately and told her not to ask questions. Armed with this new information, investigators obtained a warrant to collect a DNA sample from Derek Hollies. He was located still living in the Flagstaff area, now 50 years old and working intermittently in construction. The sample was processed and compared against the partial DNA profile recovered from Jessica Brennan's jacket collar in 2013. The results came back as a match. The genetic markers aligned. The probability of the DNA belonging to someone other than Derek Hollies was calculated at 1 in several billion. It was the evidence investigators had needed for 2 decades. On March 8, 2017, Derek Hollies was arrested at his residence without incident. A search warrant executed simultaneously uncovered additional items of interest. In a storage shed on the property, investigators found a coil of nylon rope consistent with the type that could have caused the ligature marks found on Jessica's neck. While the rope itself could not be definitively linked to the murder due to the passage of time and the absence of biological evidence on it, its presence was noted. More significantly, a box containing old photographs, receipts, and personal items included a keychain that Patricia Hollies identified as one Derek had used in the late 90s. Attached to it was a single key that would later be tested and found to match the lock on Jessica Brennan's apartment complex exterior gate, a gate that required a tenant-issued key or visitor access. Derek Hollies had retained a copy from his subcontracting work in December 1996. The arrest sent shockwaves through Flagstaff. Media coverage intensified. Residents who remembered the case from 20 years earlier expressed disbelief and relief in equal measure. Jessica's parents, now in their 70s, released a statement thanking law enforcement and Patricia Hollies for her courage in coming forward. The Coconino County Attorney's Office charged Derek Hollies with first-degree murder. The legal proceedings moved forward with meticulous care. During pretrial hearings, the prosecution laid out the case. Derek Hollies had access to Jessica's apartment complex. He had been familiar with her routines through observation during his contract work. On New Year's Eve, he had likely followed her as she left the party, intercepted her before she reached home, and forced her into his vehicle. The prosecution theorized that he drove her to the remote area near Picture Canyon, a location he knew well from recreational use and work-related travel on forest roads. There, he strangled her. The lack of sexual assault suggested a motive rooted in control, opportunity, and perhaps an obsession that had gone undetected. The missing purse and keys indicated an attempt to delay identification and create confusion about her whereabouts. Defense attorneys argued that the DNA evidence, while compelling, was circumstantial. They claimed that Derek Hollies had done work at the apartment complex and could have innocently left trace DNA on a shared surface that later transferred to Jessica's clothing. They challenged the timeline provided by Patricia Hollies, suggesting her memory after 20 years was unreliable and influenced by bias following a contentious divorce. They pointed to the absence of any direct witness placing Derek and Jessica together that night. The defense painted Derek as a man wrongfully accused based on outdated forensic interpretations and the accusations of an embittered ex-wife. The trial began in October 2017. The prosecution called forensic experts who explained the DNA evidence in detail. They emphasized that touch DNA recovered from the interior collar of a jacket, an area in close contact with the neck, was highly indicative of direct physical interaction, not passive transfer. The expert testified that for Derek Hollies' DNA to appear in that location, he would have needed sustained, forceful contact with Jessica Brennan, consistent with an act of strangulation. Patricia Hollies testified about the events of early January 1997, her observations of Derek's behavior, and her regret over remaining silent for so long. Her testimony was emotional but measured. She withstood cross-examination. Investigators presented the timeline constructed from witness statements, cell tower records from 1997, showing Derek Hollies' phone pinging off towers consistent with movement toward the Picture Canyon area in the early hours of January 1st, and the physical evidence of the key and rope. The prosecution also introduced testimony from a former coworker of Derek Hollies, who recalled him making inappropriate comments about women who lived in buildings where they worked, though this witness could not specifically recall comments about Jessica. The cumulative weight of evidence built a narrative of premeditation, opportunity, and concealment. The defense countered with character witnesses who described Derek as a quiet, hard-working individual with no history of violence. They attempted to introduce doubt about the reliability of DNA technology from samples stored for decades. They argued that the forest roads near Picture Canyon were used by dozens of people, and that vehicle tracks and tire impressions were too degraded to be meaningful. They suggested alternative theories, including the possibility of an unknown assailant, but offered no substantive evidence to support these claims. After 3 weeks of testimony, the case went to the jury. Deliberations lasted 4 days. On November 2, 2017, the jury returned a verdict of guilty on 1 count of first-degree murder. Derek Hollies showed no visible reaction. Jessica's mother wept quietly in the gallery. Her father sat with his hands folded, staring straight ahead. The conviction carried a sentence of life in prison without the possibility of parole. Sentencing occurred in January 2018, almost 21 years to the day after Jessica Brennan's body was discovered. The judge presided over a courtroom filled with journalists, family members, and community members who had followed the case for 2 decades. Jessica's parents were given the opportunity to deliver victim impact statements. Her mother spoke first, her voice steady despite visible emotion. She described the years of not knowing, the holidays marked by absence, the graduations and weddings Jessica would never experience. She spoke of the relief that came with finally having answers, tempered by the knowledge that no verdict could return their daughter. Jessica's father followed, his statement brief. He thanked the investigators who never gave up, the forensic scientists whose work made justice possible, and Patricia Hollies for finding the strength to speak. He asked the judge to impose the maximum sentence. Derek Hollies was given the opportunity to address the court. His attorney advised him to remain silent, but he chose to speak. He maintained his innocence, claiming he had been wrongly convicted based on coincidence and faulty science. He expressed no remorse, offered no explanation, and made no acknowledgement of Jessica Brennan or her family. The judge listened without expression. When Hollies finished, the judge delivered the sentence: life imprisonment without parole. Hollies was remanded into custody and transported to the Arizona State Prison Complex in Florence, where he would spend the remainder of his life. The resolution of the case brought a measure of closure to Flagstaff, a community that had carried the weight of an unsolved murder for 20 years. Local news outlets covered the sentencing extensively. Editorials praised the perseverance of law enforcement and the advancements in forensic science that had made the conviction possible. The case became a reference point in discussions about cold case investigations, the importance of witness cooperation, and the role of evolving DNA technology in solving crimes that had once seemed beyond reach. Patricia Hollies gave a single interview to a local television station after the trial concluded. She spoke about the difficulty of coming forward, the years of guilt, and the relief she felt knowing she had finally done the right thing. She expressed sympathy for Jessica's family and hoped that her testimony had provided them with some measure of peace. She declined further media requests and returned to her life in Nevada, seeking to move forward from a chapter that had defined too much of her past. Investigators involved in the case reflected on the challenges and breakthroughs. The original detectives, now retired, were contacted and informed of the arrest and conviction. Many expressed satisfaction that the case had been resolved, even if it had taken far longer than anyone had hoped. The forensic team responsible for re-examining the evidence in 2013 noted that without the decision to revisit cold cases using updated DNA methods, the match would never have been made. The case underscored the value of preserving evidence meticulously, even when immediate results were not forthcoming. Jessica Brennan's family established a scholarship in her name at the University of Arizona, aimed at supporting young women studying business administration. The scholarship fund was modest but meaningful, a way to honor Jessica's memory and ensure that her life, though cut short, contributed something positive to the world. Her parents continued to live in Tucson, aging quietly, their grief softened but never absent. They attended the first scholarship award ceremony in 2019, meeting the recipient, a 21-year-old woman with plans to work in nonprofit management. Jessica's mother remarked that her daughter would have liked that. The case files were eventually archived, boxed, and stored in the climate-controlled evidence facility maintained by the Coconino County Sheriff's Office. They remain accessible for review, a record of the investigation, the breakthrough, and the justice that followed. The crime scene near Picture Canyon remains as it was, unmarked except by the passage of seasons. Snow still falls there each winter. The cottonwood tree stands. Hikers and skiers pass through, unaware of the history beneath their feet. Derek Hollies adapted to life in prison with the same sullen detachment he had exhibited during the trial. He filed an appeal in 2019, arguing that the DNA evidence had been improperly handled and that his constitutional rights had been violated during the investigation. The appeal was denied. He filed a second appeal in 2021, this time claiming ineffective assistance of counsel. That too was denied. Legal experts noted that the evidence against him had been overwhelming and that his appeals lacked substantive merit. He remained incarcerated, removed from society, his name associated permanently with the crime he committed on New Year's Eve in 1997. The community moved on as communities do, but the memory of Jessica Brennan lingered in the way such tragedies always do. Her case became part of local history, referenced in true crime discussions, cited in training materials for law enforcement, and remembered by those who had known her or followed the investigation. Flagstaff continued to grow, the university expanded, new residents arrived, and the city evolved. But for those who had been there in 1997, who had seen the flyers, who had joined the searches, who had hoped for her safe return, the resolution brought a quiet sense of completion. The case illustrated the intersection of time, technology, and human courage. Without Patricia Holly's coming forward, the DNA match would have remained a file entry with no suspect to compare it against. Without the decision to re-examine old evidence using new methods, the DNA profile would never have been generated. Without the careful preservation of evidence over 2 decades, nothing would have been available to test. Each element was necessary. Each played a role in the final outcome. Jessica Brennan was 22 years old when she died. She had been starting her adult life, building a career, making friends in a new town, and looking toward a future that was stolen from her on a cold winter night. The investigation into her death spanned 2 decades, involved hundreds of interviews, thousands of hours of work, and ultimately hinged on science and conscience. Justice came late, but it came. The years following Derek Holly's conviction brought incremental changes to how cold cases were handled in Arizona. The Brennan case became a training example for law enforcement agencies across the state, demonstrating the importance of maintaining evidence integrity and revisiting unsolved crimes as technology advanced. The Arizona Department of Public Safety established a dedicated cold case unit in 2019, partially inspired by the successful resolution of Jessica's murder. The unit was tasked with reviewing unsolved homicides dating back decades, applying modern forensic techniques to evidence that had been collected before such methods existed. Several cases were reopened. Some yielded new leads. Others remained frustratingly unsolved. Forensic scientists who had worked on the DNA analysis published findings in a peer-reviewed journal, detailing the methodologies used to extract and amplify the genetic material from Jessica's clothing. The paper was cited in subsequent research and became part of the growing body of literature on touch DNA recovery from fabric surfaces. The case demonstrated that even minimal biological material, properly preserved, could provide conclusive identification years or even decades after a crime. The implications extended beyond homicide investigations, influencing how evidence was collected and stored in sexual assault cases, missing persons investigations, and other serious crimes. The role of Patricia Holly's in solving the case sparked broader conversations about domestic abuse, coercive control, and the barriers that prevent witnesses from coming forward. Advocacy groups in Arizona used her story to illustrate the long-term psychological impact of living with a violent or controlling partner. Patricia had not been physically harmed by Derek Holly's, but the environment of fear and intimidation had been enough to silence her for 20 years. Her eventual decision to speak was framed not as a single act of courage, but as the culmination of years of healing, therapy, and distance from the trauma. Organizations working with domestic violence survivors pointed to her example as evidence that witness cooperation could occur long after the immediate aftermath of a crime, and that law enforcement needed to remain receptive to information, no matter how much time had passed. In Flagstaff, the seasonal rhythms continued. Each winter brought snow to the San Francisco peaks. Each New Year's Eve, the town celebrated with fireworks and gatherings, though for some, the date carried a shadow. Jessica's former roommate, Emily Carter, who had filed the initial missing person report, moved away from Flagstaff in 1999. She had found it too difficult to remain in a place so associated with loss. She relocated to Colorado, married, and had children. In 2018, after learning of Derek Hollies' conviction, she reached out to Jessica's parents through a mutual acquaintance. They spoke briefly. Emily expressed relief that the case had been solved and guilt that she had not noticed anything unusual in the days before Jessica disappeared. Jessica's mother reassured her that there had been nothing to notice, that predators often operated invisibly, and that no one could have predicted what happened. The conversation brought Emily a degree of peace she had not expected. The insurance office where Jessica had worked closed in 2005, a victim of corporate consolidation. The building was repurposed into a coffee shop and then a yoga studio. None of the current occupants knew the history. The apartment complex where Jessica had lived underwent renovations in 2010. The exterior gates were replaced with a modern access control system. The courtyard was landscaped. New tenants came and went, unaware that a young woman who had once lived there had been murdered just blocks away. The erasure was not deliberate but inevitable, the result of time and turnover. Jessica's gravesite in Tucson became a place of quiet visitation. Her parents traveled there on her birthday each year, bringing flowers and spending time in reflection. The headstone bore her name, the years of her birth and death, and a simple inscription chosen by her mother. Beloved daughter, forever missed. The grave was well maintained, surrounded by similar markers in a cemetery that stretched across several acres. On clear days, the Santa Catalina Mountains were visible in the distance. It was peaceful. It was not where Jessica should have been, but it was where her story ended. Derek Hollies remained incarcerated in Florence, Arizona. He worked in the prison laundry, a routine job assigned to inmates serving life sentences. He had no visitors. His family, what remained of it, had distanced themselves after the conviction. His younger brother, who had initially believed in his innocence, eventually accepted the evidence and ceased communication. Derek spent his days in a 6-by-9-foot cell, his nights on a thin mattress, his existence reduced to the parameters set by the Arizona Department of Corrections. He aged, his hair grayed, his health declined. The world outside continued without him. In 2023, a documentary filmmaker reached out to Jessica's parents requesting permission to include her case in a series about cold case solutions. They declined. They had no interest in prolonging the public examination of their daughter's death. They preferred that Jessica be remembered by those who knew her, not commodified for entertainment. The filmmaker respected their wishes and moved on to other cases. Jessica's story remained in the public record, accessible to anyone who searched for it, but it was not sensationalized further. The resolution of Jessica Brennan's murder did not erase the pain of her loss. It did not restore the years her family spent wondering. It did not return the life she should have lived, but it provided answers. It confirmed that her death had not been random, that the person responsible had been identified, and that he would face consequences. It affirmed that persistence, science, and human conscience could combine to pierce the silence that surrounded unsolved crimes. On a cold January morning in 2025, 28 years after Jessica was found in Picture Canyon, her parents stood at her grave. The air was crisp. The cemetery was quiet. They did not speak. They had said everything over the years. They had grieved, hoped, despaired, and eventually found a fragile equilibrium. Justice had been served. Their daughter had not been forgotten. In the end, that was all they could ask for. They placed fresh flowers at the base of the headstone and drove home through the Arizona desert, the mountains receding behind them.